it was his wife who played the bass. And there's this great picture of her in the first chapter. So it's like, even from the very origins of what we think of as a bass guitar, women were playing it.
Hi, and welcome to ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman. If you've ever wanted to learn bass, but you think, oh, maybe you're too old or your body won't cooperate, you should know that right now there are thousands of people inside the For Bass Players Only community. A lot of them in their 50s, 60s, 70s. I've got students in their 80s, both men and women. And you know what they're doing? They're learning bass. They're playing music that they love. They're having the time of their life. You should come join them and experience that incredible transformation for yourself. As I always say, you're never too old to groove. So let's play bass. My guest this week is Dr. Brian Wright. He is an assistant professor of music history at the University of North Texas, where he teaches courses on popular music. His new book, The Bastard Instrument, A Cultural History of the Electric Bass, focuses on Dr. Wright's specialty in the early history of the electric bass in jazz, rock, rhythm and blues, and country music. A bassist himself, Dr. Wright earned a PhD in historical musicology from Case Western Reserve University and served as a research assistant at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Library and Archive. It is an amazing book. We're going to talk about The Bastard Instrument right now. Here's my interview with Dr. Brian Wright. Hi, Brian. It's good to have you on the show. Welcome to ForBassPlayersOnly.com.
Hey, John, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you today. And, I look forward to our conversation.
I've been really excited about it because you wrote an incredible book, The Bastard Instrument, A Cultural History of the Electric Bass. I want to talk all about that. By the way, every bass player must read this book, The Bastard Instrument. You got to read it. There's so much in there, and we'll get into that. But I want to start just with your story and the beginnings, your initial exposure to music, how you were first introduced to music. Do you come from a musical family? Were your parents musical? Did you have brothers and sisters and records playing in the house and things like that? What was
I actually don't really come from a musical family, but I do have a cool older sister. And that was the real secret to my childhood. Growing up in the 90s, she was a couple years older than me. She had all the CDs. She was really hip and knew about music. And so as a kid, I was exposed to a lot of music. I love music. I love listening to it. But it was really through my sister that I got my quote unquote education, in good music, if you will. And then from there, by the time I was a teenager, I wanted to start playing music, being in bands, whatever. I actually started out on guitar, fiddled around with that. Classic story, didn't really work for me. And then switched over to bass. And it turns out everybody needs a bass player. There was much more opportunities to mess around with that. And I really just fell in love with the bass. And, I loved the low end. I was always more interested in groove and rhythm and that side of things. And so it really clicked for me. And then I played in bands for a long time, and I lived in LA for a little while, and, tried to do the music thing more seriously. And then
you're from where originally, though?
I grew up in upstate New York. I grew up in Syracuse, New York. But I moved around a lot as a kid and spent some time in California. And then while I was in LA doing the music thing and waiting tables and sleeping on a futon, my early 20s, I ended up going to UCLA and getting a degree in music history as well. And so I kind of found new ways to combine my different interests. And from there, I kind of went the historian route. Once it seemed like the music thing probably wasn't going to be long term where I was going to end up, I found that I actually really loved writing about music history and, trying to tell stories and really dig up, stories that hadn't been told before and really, especially when it came to the bass, find this deep origins that, have kind of been lost to time. And so I went from there and I did it. I don't know how far you want to go, but I did a couple degrees and I got a PhD, and now I work at a university. And so I'm now much more of a historian than a musician, I would say.
All right, that's a great overview. I want to fill in just a few of the gaps. First of all, you reminded me of I wanted to play guitar. I ended up playing bass. Everybody needs a bass player. There's a quote by Mark Twain that I've always liked. He said, "When everyone is digging for gold, it's a good time to be in the pick and shovel business." So I think we can find a parallel there
Yeah.
between guitar players and bass players. Everybody wants to be a guitar player, so it's a good time to be a bass player because every guitar player needs a bass player, right?
I mean, I don't mean to jump too far into the book already, but one of the stories I tell in the book is about like why Leo Fender invented the precision bass. And basically, in the World War II era, big bands are declining. There aren't as many gigs out there. He basically invents it for guitar players so they can double on bass. So very much in a lot of ways, I wouldn't have framed it this way in the book, but Leo Fender kind of is in the pick and shovel business if you think about it.
Yeah. I do want to get into the book.
Yeah.
Just one more thing. When you said it didn't work out with the guitar, does that mean like a lot of other people that I wanted to play guitar, but there were already 1,000 guitar players and everybody needed a bass player? Or were you drawn to the bass because I know you loved it once you discovered it, but how did
Yeah.
you actually discover the bass? Then we'll get into the book.
Well, I don't mean to hurt my own authenticity by admitting that I still play guitar. So I won't. Hopefully, I've already offended your audience before we've even
No, you're
begun.
not the only one.
But no, I mean, I still mess around with the guitar, and I work with different programs that give guitar lessons. Different charities that help with that. So I still kind of play that to some extent. I just felt it's not that it didn't click in the sense that I couldn't do it. It just didn't hold my interest. I wasn't, I could look up chords and I could play along to songs, but it wasn't like it didn't really engage me. But once I started playing bass, and especially, I mean, the things I love about the bass are maybe a little obvious, but the fact that it's all in fourths, so all the patterns in one spot work everywhere else, like really unlocked some things for me as a player that guitar didn't right away. That I suddenly was able to visualize and understand the bass in a way that I wasn't with guitar when I was a teenager. And I think there, it grew, and I played in bands, and it went from there.
Are you familiar with the guitarist Stanley Jordan, the two-handed tapping guy?
Yeah.
I was going to say remember in the 80s, but you wouldn't remember. I'd have read about him because you're his story.
Sure.
Reason I mention him, I remember reading about him, reading an interview or something. He tunes his guitar in fourths. So instead of that B string and then the E string, so the B string is actually a C and the high E is actually an F, which makes so much sense to me. So
yes, us bass players, we love our fourths. Everybody should tune the way we tune, I guess.
Except there are a couple bass players of note. What's his name? Red Mitchell, great jazz bass player. He tuned his bass in fifths. And I met the principal bass player for the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, which is named Joel. I forgot his name. But anyway, he tunes his bass in fifths. Joel Quarrington, that's his name.
Well, I also think about like there's outliers, like Mark Sandman from Morphine, who I always really loved, and he was play like 2-string slide bass in octaves or fifths or something like that too. So it gets there's room to try out new things, right? For sure.
Absolutely. All right. So, what inspired you to write this book? Because I read it, I absolutely loved it. So let me start with that question.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was coming up and developing a career as a music historian, people had mentioned to me, my mentors had said, "Oh, you should write about the bass." Because you're a bass player, and that makes sense in some ways. And I was initially really hesitant to do it. I was like, "What? Somebody has to have already done this, right? I can't be the first person to actually do this. I'm sure this work exists, and there's lots of great work that exists, from." Richard R. Smith, who does Fender history, or like the people who used to write for Bass Player magazine, right? There's good work on bass, but like the origin story, the real early years and how it came about in a sort of detailed narrative way, it turns out it just hadn't been done before, which is very surprising to me, given, how many people play bass, like if you think about how many books there are about the electric guitar, like my shelf behind me probably has 25 books on the electric guitar. It's crazy that there isn't one about the bass. And so I decided at that point that I would just see if it was interesting to me, if I would start looking things up and, trying to dig into the archives. It was actually kind of a complicated book to research because a lot of the stories I tell are not the stories that are like widely known. So you have to find those. You have to it took me, all told, it took me, I think, 12 years from the beginning to the end of the book.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. It's one of the questions I was going to ask you, and I think you may have kind of answered it. How much did you already know that you wanted to document versus how much did you actually learn about during the process of writing the book?
So coming out of my training as like a musicologist and music historian, the basic premise I wanted to start with the book was, I grew up reading Bass Player Mag. I had a subscription to all that stuff. Like I read voraciously. I watched a lot of, behind the music. Like I was a big fan of, print
Oh,
journalism and all those things. And
PhD.
I yeah, and I had heard a very particular version of events when it came to the history of popular music in the 50s and 60s. I had heard basically a consistent story. And anytime that you're a historian and you hear so much of a consistent story, it makes you ask what are the other stories that are being left out here? And so the basic premise I had when I started doing the research was I'm not going to pretend I don't know those stories or I haven't heard them before, but I'm going to do my best to start completely from scratch. Instead of just reading the story that's been handed down for decades and decades and decades, I'm going to try and get back to as close to I can as the 1950s and 1960s and really dig up new stories and think about new perspectives here. And the reason that's useful more than anything else is it allowed me to find all these new bass players that I had never heard of. So the book ends, to be fair to your audience, I should tell you the book ends around the early 70s, like 1971. And so it ends by talking about much more famous people, John Entwistle, Bootsy Collins, it ends with some more famous names. But the first chunk of it is really about the pioneers of the instrument, who I don't think are household names even among bass players. And so, trying to dig up as many of them as I could and find out what their stories were like and what their perspectives were like, and how thinking about their stories might impact how we think about our instrument as a whole. That was really the basis of what I was trying to do. So you kind of keep the good and then you add something new on top of it.
It was interesting that once this phase, the novelty and Monk Montgomery was a prominent factor, a prominent character in this story. But once everybody kind of figured it out, then jumping ahead a couple generations, people like Flea and Victor Wooten is like, wow, this is this is pretty far removed from where we started from. How did we get here from here? And the way you show how it unfolds over the years and over the decades is just fascinating. It's an incredible read and very, very well researched.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think my hope is that by the end of the book, the answer of like how we could get to where we go in the 80s and 90s is kind of clear. That you can see that it's a continual process of, people try new things and they adapt and we learn, oh, the possibilities of what we can do on this instrument expand every decade. And nowadays, probably every year, every month, every day, there's some kid on TikTok who's better at bass than I'll ever be. It is, great in pushing those things forward. And I'm happy that the instrument is alive and well for sure.
Well, let me get your take on something because I do a lot of bass player interviews and this comes up a lot. You must have seen on YouTube, mostly young people doing incredible things, very, very impressive gymnastics and contortionistic things on the bass, very, very incredible. But that's not what people want or need in a bass player. So if you want to be a YouTuber, you want to be a YouTube star, God bless you, go ahead and do it. But can you play a blues? Can you play a scale? Can you lay down a groove? So I just wondered if you could weigh in on that and give me your take. Is that okay, or is it okay with caution, or what do you think about that?
I mean, I think the music industry is hard and you got to find whatever gig you can find. And so there's lots of people who've developed great followings that people love and want to see them do those fireworks. And if that's what they want to do, that's I'm all here for that. I think that's great. I do think there's some hand wringing that we do from, coming from an older generation where it's like, it's not just about the camera being close up and how fast your hands are moving, but like, can you do that for 6 minutes in a song? Can you play, Ain't No Stopping Us Now and like really keep that groove going for 6 minutes? That endurance is really hard too. I don't begrudge anybody what their musical choices are, or how they choose to play their instrument, or where they try and find an outlet. But I also don't want to fall into the trap to think that like the old way was the right way or the better way, because and I think this is kind of true in the narrative of the book, is that each generation kind of reinvents itself and tries new things. So you could see that people probably said the same thing about James Jamerson or something, right? They definitely said it about Carol Kay, that they were overplaying on these sessions, and like, oh, it's all just virtuosity and fireworks, right? But it became part of this essential sound that the bass was contributing to, and now we think of that stuff as pretty normal, as pretty standard. And so I don't know, maybe 20 years from now we look back and this is now the standard. I don't know. I know that I don't try to compete in that world. I don't try and play that game. I write about the past, maybe because that's the music I really love. But again, like I said, I don't begrudge anybody for their, how they make their music.
Among the many interesting things in the book, with people took to it because it was louder and it could be heard, but in the studio they were still using the upright. And I think you said in a movie there was an upright in the film, but an electric was actually what you're hearing, or was it?
Yeah, that's right. It's both. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's really interesting. The original sound of a Fender Precision bass from 1951, 52, 53 is meant to sound like an upright. It's not a perfect imitation, but it had like this, foam rubber mute. It had the flat wound strings, and it had this kind of thuddy, quick decaying sound that's meant to kind of sound like an upright. And the goal of the instrument was to plausibly sound like an upright, but be loud, but that you could turn the volume up on. And that's really the key to the instrument's success. As when it was first invented, a lot of people just kind of thought it was a weird novelty or a toy or not a real instrument, right? That's kind of where the title comes from, the bastard instrument. That's how I think it was seen. That's how Montgomery describes it in the book. But what ends up happening is suddenly that volume is really useful. When you're in a bandstand and they're not individually miking the bass player, which would have been rare in the 50s, right? Suddenly being able to hear the bass keeps the band together. Suddenly it allows people who are dancing, to really lock in with the groove. So the volume is, and the amplification, which gives us the volume, is really the big key to the instrument's success.
Absolutely. And another big point was it's so much easier to travel with. Anybody that plays the upright knows that. Have you ever been on a plane with an upright, I remember having to buy a seat for my upright when I went to a bass convention, but I remember I got two meals.
I played upright for a little while, and at the time I was driving my first car, which was a two-door Chevy Cavalier. And when I had to go to gigs or whatever, I'd have to get the upright in there. And it turns out you can get an upright bass into the back seat of a Chevy Cavalier if you know like 6 secret moves to turn it and get it in. And I would just leave it in the car because I was like, if you can steal the bass out of this car, you deserve it. So, and then when I'm playing upright, it just fits in the trunk, right? You're right that it's just a lot easier. And those practical benefits are, I think, a big reason why the very, very first players took to it. It was really for the volume and for those, just like, it's easier to travel with on the road.
You remind me, I had a Camaro in those days, and I used to play in the orchestra at Wayne State University in Detroit. And after a concert, one of the girls played the violin, and she asked me if I would mind giving her a ride home. I said, I'm happy to do it, but I didn't put the bass in the back seat. The only way I could get it in was in the front seat, and then the neck goes through to have the back seat. And I didn't have just a wooden bar stool. I had this big metal clunky stool. So I had the bass here and going back here, and then I had my stool. And fortunately, she was kind of little. She said, well, no, I don't mind. And she sat like,
yeah.
But then to get her in the car and then to get her
to take it out again.
Yeah, you're bringing back some things I hadn't thought about. And then I didn't have a wheel till years later. There was the music school, and then the annex was like, I don't know, quarter of a mile, half a mile. So I used to tell people I have to cross two streets to get from the main music building to the annex. I had to cross Palmer, and I had to cross I-94. And there's a bridge over the interstate. And I'm lugging.
It's like a real intense game of Frogger or something. Yeah.
So what surprised you amongst your research for this book? There must have been some things that like, wow, I didn't know that, or I never thought about that. What jumped out at you? There must have been something.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that surprised me. I mean, it all kind of surprised me in a way, but to try and think of a couple. So one is I was really surprised to learn how many women played electric bass in the early years. That's definitely not a story that I had been told or heard about. When I was coming up, people talked about Carol Kay as being the female pioneer. But as I was researching it, it turns out there were lots and lots and lots of women playing the bass, and just people didn't put them into the history books. They didn't tell those stories.
Didn't
And
you
so,
say in the book there was a picture? You said this possibly may have been the very first ever electric bass player. Happened to be a woman. Did I remember that?
yeah, in fact, that's correct. So the early Paul Tutmark audio Vox bass, from the late 30s, early 40s, though the bass Tutmark played guitar. This is in like the tradition of like Hawaiian music. Tutmark played guitar. It was his wife who played the bass. And there's this great picture of her in the first chapter. So it's like, even from the very origins of what we think of as a bass guitar, women were playing it. And so that story was fast. I mean, talk about a story that I had never heard, but also a story that tells us a lot about our priorities and our values when it comes to how we talk about guitar history or, bass history or popular music history in general. So that to me was number one, I think the most surprising thing. And then the other thing that was surprising to me after doing all the research and writing for it was just kind of how interconnected everything was. That if you read the book, my hope is that if you read it in order, you'll see that like different people and themes come back again in complicated ways. That this one bass player who was just like a session guy making $25 an hour in Chicago playing on some Chicago blues recordings is going to be on a Chuck Berry recording that Paul McCartney is going to rip off for I Saw Her Standing There or something. And all of those stories are in the book. Or, Jack Cassidy from Jefferson Airplane and, psychedelic rock, he's playing a Versatone amp because when he was in the studio in LA, someone was like, hey, this is the bass amp Carol Kay plays. She plays a Versatone. And so that's why he went out and bought it. And so all of these bass players from all these different genres and styles and eras, it's actually kind of a coherent story where they're all one thing. It's all one thing, just different variations on it. And just seeing how incredibly interconnected it all was, I think, was the most fascinating part for me. And that's the kind of story I was trying to bring out in the book.
It's funny you mentioned the Paul McCartney bass line. I was very surprised to hear that because that's probably my favorite Paul McCartney Beatles bass line. Saw Her Standing There, and I didn't know that that had already been out there on a. Hey, oh yeah, the way you go deep into, I think there were three in one chapter in particular, Paul McCartney, John Entwistle, and Bill Wyman, and how one of them were kind of contemporary, not kind of, they were contemporaries, but how each of them had made such a profound influence on the music, not just for bass playing, but for rock and the stuff that was happening, the music that was happening in those days. I thought that was very, very interesting.
Well, and it's also part of what I was trying to do is tell new stories, right? So trying to write about the Beatles or trying to write about John Entwistle or something is hard to do if you're trying to tell a new story that hasn't been told before. And so I was always looking for other pieces of information, especially when it comes to McCartney talking about the studio production techniques that they're developing on how to record a bass, or talking about Entwistle and, the My Generation solo. I basically talk about how he was incredibly disappointed with it. The most famous bass solo in history, and the guy who played it actually doesn't like it very much. And those kinds of stories were really fascinating to me because they really reveal that these people were human beings, right? They're not that different from you and me, as much as we might think of them as like mythical titans of music, which they are, I guess, in some ways. They're also people, and they have complicated thoughts, and they come from complicated places. And so being able to dig into them and their stories while also emphasizing the sort of humanity of all of these bass players was really part of the goal of the book, not to elevate them into, mythical godlike status, but really to think of them as people.
And you inspired me to listen to songs that I had heard, and some songs I hadn't really heard, like Dwayne Eddy stuff. And I was just doing searching, and some of these old, the Shadows and bands that I had heard of but never really listened to. And but there was one that you just mentioned, this recording technique with McCartney. I remember there was something in the book that really surprised me. I said, I'm going to have to listen to that tune. And
So
that
is it the paperback writer loudspeaker on loudspeaker one? Is it that?
I was going to say I can't remember which one it was, but yeah, I think that was it. I'm going to
Yeah, so working with Jeff Emmerich and Ken Townsend at EMI Studios, they were trying to come up with how do you make your bass line sound louder? And they came up with this really crazy idea where they basically reverse engineered a loudspeaker, like two amplifiers, if you will, put them touching each other, one with the bass playing into it and the other one being turned into a microphone out. And that's how they record Paperback Writer and Rain. And they only do it on those two singles. Like, it was a real moment of experimentation, but it goes to show you like all of the different kinds of things people were trying to do with an electric bass here, in that era.
and the Larry Graham story, of course. I have never heard anybody dispute his story about how he came up with the slap. Oh, by the way, thank you for the citing in the book you mentioned for bass.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I saw your Larry Graham interview there too, and I love the way he tells the story. The best part about the Larry Graham story is it was all accidental. Basically, is what he tells you. Is that like, oh, we needed a drummer. We didn't have a drummer. We couldn't play keys anymore. I had to play this, and he talks about how he never cared about doing it the right way because he never saw himself as a bass player. And I think that's a really fascinating story because it's that approach that leads to the outside the box thinking that gives us what we think of today as like slap bass. Yeah. I do want to make one other point I forgot to make, which is that there is a Spotify playlist that goes along with the book. And so if your listeners are checking the book out or want to get a preview of some of the stuff I talk about, you can find that Spotify playlist out there. If you want to hear some of these interesting recordings from the 50s, I'd get into.
Yeah, it's we barely scratched the surface. We probably talked about a dozen examples, but it's really a great book. It's a great work, and I commend you and congratulate you on doing such an astounding job with it.
Thank you.
What else keeps you busy now that the book is done? What do? You're at the University of North Texas. I remember looking at that school when it was called North Texas State University. Your specialties are commercial music, music history, ethnomusicology, early history of electric bass in jazz, rock, rhythm, blues, country music. That's you, right? You've got your...
Yeah, that's me. In fact, yeah. So I'm a professor at the University of North Texas, where I mostly teach classes in popular music, a couple occasional classes in jazz. So we have a big music school here. And, I have my own graduate students who are working on popular music projects. And so my day-to-day, like right now I'm teaching a class on the Beatles, talking about the Beatles just now. Like that's what I do for a living is I wake up in the morning and I go in 9 a.m. and we talk about the Beatles. So it's a pretty fun gig and I'm happy to have it. I have a bunch of other projects that I'm working on. People have asked me if I'm going to write the second part of the book, if I do like go into the 70s and 80s and 90s, because certainly there's definitely another book to be written there. I have a number of other projects I'm working on. So I have some projects on country music. I have a book about Tanya Tucker I'm thinking about working on. I have a Phil Spector project I'm working on. I have a book I'm planning on the Texas International Pop Festival, which was this big hippie festival in '69, just a few weeks after Woodstock. It's basically Texas's Woodstock and is not really written about or known as nearly as widely as something like like Woodstock or Monterey Pop or something like that, but has these really fascinating stories, and also great performances by, Led Zeppelin and Sly and the Family Stone and all of those things which survive. We have the recordings of them. And so I'm thinking about writing. That's what I think at the top of my list. If you're asking what's next, I think that's where I'm going to go. Instead of trying to cover, 20 years of history, let's talk about 3 days in 1969. I'm going to kind of zoom in now. And I think that's the next project on my list.
All right, great. Is there anything else that you haven't mentioned that you've always wanted to do? It's not necessarily in the works now, but hey, I've always wanted to, or someday I'm gonna.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I have so many projects I want to do. I have this project about the Ventures, who I love, the instrumental rock band. And I have a project about their success in Japan in the mid 1960s. So, they, in the height of the surf rock boom in Japan, the Ventures were more successful than the Beatles. The Ventures sold more records than the Beatles in Japan. And, there's a really fascinating story there about the cross-cultural relationship between the US and Japan in the post-World War II era, but also the youth culture and rock and roll and how it spreads across the globe. And I've always really wanted to work on. I have a bunch of research on that's a book somewhere someday that I will hopefully get to.
Oh, well, when you write it, I'll read it.
Okay, perfect. At least I can tell the publisher that we have one confirmed sale at least.
There you go. Yeah, you did talk about the Ventures quite a bit in the book, I noticed. So yeah, there's a lot to be told there. Well, good luck with that. I do have one last question.
Yeah, sure.
What would you be, if you can imagine, if you were not a bass player? And I know you're more than a bass player. You're an academic. What's the word? How do you say it?
Academic?
Academic. I was going to say
Yes.
academician.
I like to think of myself as a little bit of a magician from time to time.
There you go. Well, what I mean to say is something outside of music. What would you be?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would have been a historian probably. I think that's where I landed, and I kind of combined the best of both worlds. So when I was young, I was really fascinated by World War II and, the First World War and going back even further. So I took a lot of history classes. I read a lot of history books. So I might have gone down that path. And so luckily I got to combine that with the other passion of mine, which is music. And so I'm very happy for how it turned out. And I'm glad you liked the book.
Yeah. I share that passion for history. I like to read Walter Isaacson and who was the guy that David McCullough.
Yeah,
And
sure.
you know uh, I just put myself on the spot needlessly. But anyway, not about me. But I'm saying, yeah, history is very fascinating, and it's interesting today because kids sort of equate the Vietnam War with the Civil War. I mean, they can't really put the proper perspective on. No, this was 50 years ago. This was 200.
So yeah, and I mean it's really interesting. So like I said, I'm teaching this class on the Beatles right now, and as part of the class, I brought in a woman named Elaine McAfee Bender, and she ran the Beatles fan club in Texas. She founded the original Beatles fan club in Texas in 1965, and she got to share with us all these great stories about what it was like to be, part of Beatlemania in the time that it actually happened. And then a few weeks later, I brought in Chuck Rainey, the bass player, and he with King Curtis opened for the Beatles at Shea Stadium. So, like, I brought in someone not only who was a fan of the Beatles in the era, but someone who like played on the same stage as them. And for my students, I think that's really a huge insight that this is not that long ago. Like there's people around who remember this stuff who were there for these things. And that was the best takeaway. As much as I can talk to them about history and tell them, what I think is important or what the stories are or how we should think about things, it's really those kind of personal human accounts that I think even in my book are what are the most fascinating and interesting to people. It's not about dates and facts and who did what when. It's like, oh, these were real human beings who lived in an era not that far away from the era we're currently living in. And I think those stories are worth celebrating. And I think my students really get a kick out of it too.
I saw the Beatles.
Where? In Detroit?
In Cleveland. I used to live in Cleveland.
Oh, okay.
The Municipal Stadium where the Browns played and the Indians played. I was 6 years old, but I was telling somebody today, I don't know if I was the only 6-year-old there, but I was definitely the hippest because I knew where I was. I knew who they were. I knew all their songs. I knew all
Wow.
music. Yeah, I will never forget. My dad was a rock and roll DJ in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, okay, great.
Us there, and he took us to the Dave Clark Five and the Lovin' Spoonful and the Association. Very, very cool way to grow up.
That is a cool way. Maybe I'll bring you in next time I do the Beatles class and you can tell your story.
Please do. Yeah, I remember it well. I remember thinking from my naive 6-year-old view of the world. I remember thinking, "Wow, it's a good thing all those policemen just happened to be here." I remember thinking that.
Oh, great.
It was planned. Well, once again, the book is called The Bastard Instrument: A Cultural History of the Electric Bass. Brian F. Wright. And like I said earlier, every bass player needs to read this. It's required reading, and we'll leave it at that.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, good luck, and I hope we'll meet soon and in person. And yeah, I'll take you up on your invitation. I'll come down to Texas and talk to your class. Maybe around January, February when it gets cold up here in Michigan. How's that?
That sounds good.
All right, my friend. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Oh, what an incredible story. Amazing book, The Bastard Instrument. Like I said, required reading. Every bass player must read this book, and every bass enthusiast. So thank you, Dr. Brian Wright. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman. If you've ever wanted to learn bass, but you think, oh, maybe you're too old or your body won't cooperate, you should know that right now there are thousands of people inside the For Bass Players Only community. A lot of them well over 50 or 60 or over 70 even. And you know what they're doing? They're learning bass. They're having the time of their life playing music that they love. You should come join them and experience that incredible transformation for yourself. As I always say, you're never too old to groove. I'll see you right back here next week, same time, same place. In the meantime, let's play bass.